Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to chapter 6 of All Quiet on the Western Front, and this is a longer chapter, so let's get right into the summary. I might have to check my notes a little bit to make sure I'm not forgetting anything, because a lot happens in this chapter. So we start off with Paul and his company having been sent to the front 2 days early. They're pretty sure an offensive is in the works. It's just a question of a defensive on whose part. The enemy or themselves. Doesn't really send a vote of confidence when they actually pass a bunch of freshly built coffins. Thanks. And in fact, despite everything, Paul is reminded how much chance plays a role in this war when he leaves the dugout he's in to go visit friends in another one, and comes back to find that a bomb has decimated the one he was supposed to be in. Ooh, yep, that's just giving you a sense of how this is gonna go. They get to see some deeper dugouts, and the first battle they actually have is a battle with the rats in the trenches, who are very forward. They call them corpse rats because they've gotten so large eating corpses. They kind of win that battle, but not really. Turns out you never quite can win against rats. Nothing much is happening for a while. They're just listening to bombs drop around them and doing busy work, which makes the old hand soldiers feel a little calmer, despite the fact that they recognize, since they're getting better rations, it usually means something bad is coming. While the old hands are getting a little calmer, the new recruits are going a little stir-crazy. In fact, they're trying to escape the dugout despite the bombardment happening, and the one that does manage to escape is killed almost instantly, and Paul just has to walk away from getting brain matter spattered on him. Yeah, it's that type of chapter. The French attack does eventually come. The bombardment passes over them without killing any of them except the recruit that tried to run out, and is now behind them, so the French troops come running in. Paul and his friends turn into what he calls instinct animals in a fight against death itself. It's not about the people who are actually across from you. Your own dad could charge up at you, and you still wouldn't hesitate to throw a grenade at him. In fact, the Germans not only survived this French attack, but they are able to push the French back to the French trenches, hop down in, and they even managed to steal some good rations. The French seem to eat better than the Germans do at this point. But they can't really bring themselves to be happy about it because the work is not done. There's a lot of back and forth, and Paul ends up having a strange vision of a churchyard while he's on watch one night that he has to kind of shake off to continue his watch. He ends up reminiscing about parachutes and poplar trees before he's finally called off from his watch and heads inside to eat something that's finally hot. But they continue on with this back and forth movement, and unfortunately across the span of about 3 days they are able to pull in some of their wounded from no man's land, but there's somebody they can hear crying that they just can't find. He's badly wounded, can't move himself, and unfortunately, since they can't find him over the span of the 3 days, they just hear him die. Yet birds and butterflies don't seem to be affected by the war. A thing that Paul notes that gives a slight bit of whimsy to everybody dying horribly. Because in fact, we go back to people dying horribly. Another bombardment begins, and it turns out the recruits are dying in droves. They simply aren't trained enough to be able to handle the madness of the trenches right away. They can't tell the difference about what bombs they should be worried about, and don't understand how long they need to wear their gas masks for. If you're in a hole, you need to wear it longer. Gas does collect at the bottom. And unfortunately, we even lose one of our group of men in this chapter. They can have another raid against the French, and Paul goes sliding into a dugout to find Himmelstoss in the same dugout, pretending to be wounded. He beats him over the head a bit, trying to convince him to leave, but it's only when a superior officer comes along and actually orders them out that Himmelstas snaps out of whatever he's in and goes charging off to actually lead the charge against the enemy lines. I mean, that just happened. The wounds and the death are horrific, and yes, it is often described in detail. And then suddenly it's over. Even Paul doesn't seem to realize it until he's standing half asleep on the truck. They gather together and find out there is only 32 men remaining of Company 2. They started this day out with a little over 80, if you remember from the start of the book. And originally they had 150. The numbers speak. Truth be told, I think this is probably going to be a shorter video because a lot of what's here in this chapter speaks for itself in a lot of ways. The death and destruction may seem really grim and gruesome, but I think it is extremely important in a book like this to be included. Because that's really what helps push forward the idea that this is not a happy, fun adventure time. By making it like hyper-realistic and describing things in detail, it should be repulsing you. You should feel ugh, right? And in an interesting way, I think this is also important to read when it comes to those you weren't sided with in the war. Like, I'm Canadian, so the Canadians were fighting against the Germans, along with the British, the French, the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese. But that is still important because when you realize that they're human, like, that's the key moment. Because, and Paul says it here, in battle you tend to just glaze over. You can't think about these people as human. You can't even think of yourself as human because you're just going through so much horrible stuff and doing horrible things. Like, Paul and his friends are actively killing people to avoid death themselves. But that's precisely why people of the generation of peace have to sit down and read something like this, recognize the humanity in people who were once our enemies, and how absolutely gruesome something like this actually is. We're more likely to want to avoid doing that at any point when you know exactly who you're fighting, right? When you know the enemy is human. And truth be told, it's also helpful travel. One of the big reasons that this book speaks to me is I took German in high school. We had a German exchange student I was friends with. I went to Germany in high school with that class, and I even met another German exchange student in university. Getting to know people from other countries and getting to like them is precisely what's going to help in your head prevent that us versus them mentality. If you just purely know your own group of people, it's a lot easier to not have conflicted feelings and say, well, for whatever reason, they're different than us. They're not really like us. No, you go to a place, you meet the people, you interact with them, and you find out they're precisely like you. They like good food. They like maple syrup. I legitimately went to Neuschwanstein Castle. I took a horse-drawn carriage ride back down. I was sitting between the German driver and a woman from China who spoke to me about Canada. It's precisely those moments that make you want to avoid something like this as much as possible. Because you can't separate those moments in your head. You can't say, like, this entire group of people is actually bad and the enemy, because you have had moments where you've met this group and they're human. I'm sure they have flaws. I'm sure they argue with their parents as much as maybe I do. More, less. They have kids. They have mothers and fathers. They have brothers and sisters. And suddenly, yeah, no, I don't really want to blow a bunch of people up. And this sort of plays that role of giving you a really visceral experience of what happens when we do get to that point of absolute violence with each other. Because it's not just... You also can't read this book and say it's... Yeah, the Germans in here are the bad guy. Because Paul is a very sympathetic character who is trying to explain that they're doing this just because they want to survive. That there is something about him and his personality that has to get turned off in order to just keep throwing grenades. But wartime precisely makes it easier to turn that thing off. Again, like I said, at the start of the battle, he actually hesitates because he meets an oncoming Frenchman's eyes and, like, connects in that moment. But once that connection over, once that battle is continuing, it's just like all of that clicks off. And he says, my own father could be charging at me, and I wouldn't hesitate to throw a grenade at him. Because war requires that shut-off valve for human emotions and human empathy. So, what actually happens when you read books like All Quiet on the Western Front is it's precisely trying to turn on that valve. It's precisely trying to have this connecting point for somebody who never had to experience something like this, in a hopes that you prevent it from ever happening again. So a lot of this chapter is just the absolute visceral experience of the horrors of war in all different senses. It's the horror of the bombardment. It's the horror of the trenches, of the rats attacking. Like, that is your first introduction. Enrique does kind of ease you into it here by starting with the rats. But if you like animals, if you felt really bad for the horses, well, these animals are also just trying to survive. These rats are trying to survive. But everything is absolutely at war with each other in this moment where they're desperately just trying to survive and get what they need to survive. So the rats, the closeness, the confines, the constant fear that the next bomb is going to do you in, the gas attacks, the men charging at you, the need to charge back at them. All of it is just this absolute feeling of, no, I don't want this, no, please stop. And that's important to have in a book so that you don't have to experience in real life. There are a few other things that I do want to comment on sort of separately, but like I said, this is going to be a shorter video simply because I don't think I can talk about this chapter with a lot of justice, because it is sort of that moment that you need to get into the book and feel the horrors and the camaraderie and what you're trying to deal with. And some of the things I do want to comment on are the odd little moments of this dreamlike quality of Paul. He has this vision of the church. He looks at the poplar trees that he used to play amongst as a child. He sees the birds and the butterflies. And it is sort of this whimsy experience floating through an absolutely horrible situation. And it is sort of this moment of, like, peace. But some of them, it should give you a sense of, like, how far these men have been pushed. Like, Paul's standing on this watch and has this vision of a church scene. And that's, like, he's on high alert right now, right? They've been under attack for how long? They've been just constantly pushed and pushed and pushed. The man is exhausted, and he has this vision of a church that he has to shake himself out of, but he can't quite get away from this want for everything to end so he can have breathing space. Because then the next thing he thinks about is sort of this whimsy of the parachutes and then the poplar trees and things like this. So there are odd little moments sprinkled throughout this very long chapter that break up just how horrible the war is, that actually highlight how horrible everything else is. Because moments like this can actually be very dangerous. If you get distracted too much, I mean, you could be done, right? And the recruit running in a panic out of the dugout is precisely proof of this. So Paul is getting distracted in a moment that he precisely can't get distracted in because it could kill him. But your brain has some safety mechanisms. It is trying to take care of you as much as it can, so does your body. And there's got to be a point where it just kind of shuts down to try and just make it all stop. And in war, you have to push past that. And the one final thing I will mention is the sudden abrupt jump to everything being over, the chapter ending. But again, that's precisely how Paul's brain is perceiving things right now. Time doesn't really have meaning after all of this. It's just been absolute survival. So when things are given a chance to shut down, they do. And he sort of comes back to himself, like when they're on the trucks heading away from the front, and he's just like, I guess it's over. Like, it's this weird little moment, but I think we need to recognize that those cuts in the story are precisely to help communicate how somebody going through trench warfare is perceiving time and space. Which is to say, after a long bombardment like this, he's not perceiving it. He's requiring to work on instincts because that's all he's got functioning right now. And instincts aren't really important when you're on the truck heading away from the front. So yeah, there is sort of this moment where just things sort of stop and then come back in. And we finish up with the numbers. Because with everything we're told throughout this chapter, of all the death and destruction, all the descriptions of the wounded, all that visceral stuff that we need to know to want to make sure this never happens again, is then consolidated in a number at the end. And this number is far more powerful than that 80 that we had at the start, because we know the people included here now. And we've met the scared little recruits and the hardened soldiers who still cry out for their moms. And so 32 suddenly becomes just a heartbreaking number after the entire chapter. It solidifies what has happened. This wasn't a dream that Paul had, or better yet, a nightmare. He can't wake up from this. That number of 32 confirms that they've lost so much in this trip. And unfortunately, Remarque does not pull back here. He is here to drive the point home. War is madness and death and destruction. And it's never going to be anything but that. So we still have the rest of the book to go. We are only halfway through at this point. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.